So some of the other myths that have emerged and that help to maintain this illusion of a DIY society are things like the myth of meritocracy, which helps to maintain not only gender divisions, but racial divisions and class divisions within our society by painting the picture that some people are simply more deserving of support than others, in kind of ignoring the context of racial oppression, ignoring the context of gendered oppression, ignoring the deep kind of economic inequalities, the wealth hoarding that we've seen in recent generations, and the way that has limited opportunities for many folks. It's this kind of myth of meritocracy. It often comes wrapped up in good choices rhetoric.
Welcome to another episode of Women Investing in Women. Robin and I are thrilled and always moved by the different women we have the honor and privilege of talking to week after week. Women do so much in society as part of paid work, unpaid work, kinship support, social support. A lot of times it's not recognized because it is not paid for. And it is not managed through KPIs and performance management tools. It's not even considered work. And as we celebrate women and as we honor women, it is important for us to take the time and recognize the amount of work women do. Research shows that $1 billion worth of work is done by women for no pay every day around the world. If the world has to pay us women for what we do, we will all be broke. So the fact that we are willing to do this and put our egos aside and do it for the greater good shows that we have that special something inside of us. And how do we recognize that, honor that, and then take that and channel to support each other so that we can truly lift each other up and in the process raise sons who are going to be different than our forefathers. To have this exciting conversation with us, you're going to love our guest today. And Robin is going to introduce you and take this conversation away.
Awesome. I am so excited to have Jessica Calarco on our program. And I read about her in an article in the Atlantic magazine where she had written a book called Holding It Together, How Women Became America's Safety Net. And this is a topic that Cass and I have talked about privately and on this podcast before. And it is a huge topic near and dear to our hearts. And so I reached out to found Jessica online and reached out and said, oh my gosh, will you be on our program? And I am just beyond excited to have her. So Jessica, tell us a little bit about the book is just, I think recently has come out, and tell us a little bit about it. And you've written other books of related things. And so how did you drop into this topic?
Sure. Well, thank you so much for inviting me to be here with you both. Clearly the work that you are doing dovetails so perfectly with the kind of work that I'm trying to share, the kinds of arguments that I'm trying to make in this book. I will hold up here for you. Holding It Together, How Women Became America's Safety Net. So essentially this work, my earlier research was mostly on inequalities in education and families as they related to education and schools. But in the wake of having my own 2 young children, I started a new project where I was initially interested in sort of the best laid plans of parenthood. I wanted to understand kind of the ideas that parents have about the kinds of decisions they make for their young children, and then what gets in the way and how they feel about themselves in the process when they're not able to make those decisions that they intend, and what kinds of structural inequalities shape those forces as well. And so I started a project back in 2018 where I was following 250 women from pregnancy through their first couple of years postpartum. And the pandemic hit in the middle of the data collection. We were following up with those same women and their children and their partners kind of every 6 months after pregnancy. And the pandemic hit in the middle of those interviews and surveys that we were doing, and it became so apparent so quickly how much of an impact kind of COVID was having. The kinds of school and childcare closures, closures of elder care facilities, the stress on our healthcare system, that women and families were taking on so much of the labor of that moment and being forced to be the ones to fill in the gaps. And so this book came out of a desire to understand, how did we get here? How did we get to the point where women are our crisis management team, where instead of investing in the kinds of social structures that other countries often take for granted, that the kinds of safety net programs that especially high-income countries use to manage risks and responsibilities in people's lives, how did we come to what I talk about in the book as this DIY society instead, one where we expect people to just make good choices and not actually need support and not actually need the kind of support that other countries often take for granted in terms of what people are able to rely on and getting by in their day-to-day lives. And both through my own research with families and surveys that we did across the US, as well as through digging into the history and the policy research, what I found is that essentially this DIY model, it comes from the fact that in the US, billionaires and big corporations often don't want to pay for the kinds of safety nets that many other countries take for granted. And so they've kind of leveraged their wealth to promote this DIY model, this sort of good choices model. But the reality is that DIY model, it doesn't work. We can't just DIY society. Sure, some people might be able to get by without a social safety net, but there are plenty among us, including children and elderly people who are sick or disabled or socially marginalized, who need support from others. And so collectively, this DIY model leaves us with too much risk and responsibility for everyone to manage on their own. And yet we've managed, as I show in the book, to maintain this illusion of a DIY society by relying on women disproportionately to be the ones to fill in the gaps in our economy and our social safety net, and doing the work of caring for others who can't fully take care of themselves. And I show in the book that this work is crushing women, and yet we haven't fixed these kinds of problems because the same billionaires and big corporations who brought us this DIY society have also tried to sell us a set of myths aimed at deluding us into believing that we don't actually need a social safety net, and also aimed at dividing us by race and class and gender and politics and religion in ways that keep us from coming together to demand the kind of net that we desperately need and deserve.
This is such an important conversation to have today. And even during COVID, we saw millions of women get out of the workforce. And all the progress we made pre-COVID, we've lost. And even during COVID, women could work from home, so they were happy to juggle. Men still went into work. And so we continue to create an environment where men work together, they hop up together, they have coffee together. Therefore, they promote each other. Women are continuing to be left behind. Based on your research and what we are seeing, what is driving the devaluation of women? There is such a accelerated devaluation of women, their bodies, their contribution, their very existence on one end. And on another end, the emergence of this, we're a Christian nation, Christian value. I'm a non-Christian, I'm a Hindu, but I'm observing this like having an out-of-body experience. And I always ask the question, even the Son of God needed the womb of a human woman to come into this world. So if a human woman is that powerful, what in the male psyche that is so fearful that they have to devalue and dehumanize?
Yeah, that's a great set of questions. And I think really it comes back to the fact that our DIY model only works if women are exploited, in the sense that, women hold 70% of the lowest wage jobs in the U.S. economy. And those are disproportionately jobs often done by women of color or low-income women, women without college degrees, who are, those are the kinds of jobs that are essential to our economy, but that are too labor-intensive to be both highly profitable and also broadly accessible. Things like childcare, things like home health care, so those kinds of services that we need to make our economy function, but that no one wants to really pay for, and that other countries have made part of the social safety net. And so one of the best ways that we've found to force women to fill in those gaps in our economy, and certainly to fill in the gaps that are left in terms of unpaid caregiving, by the lack of investment in universal childcare, the lack of investment in universal health care, and the burden that places on families to manage that themselves, the best way to force women into doing that kind of work is to trap them in motherhood and to leave them with limited support. Certainly that's not the only way, But burdening them with young children and leaving them with no support in raising those children is one of the best ways that we have to force women to take whatever job is offered to them, no matter how meagerly paid, and to be grateful for whatever opportunities they're offered, rather than demanding more support and the kinds of opportunities that they're preferring or that they would be interested in pursuing. And on the unpaid care front, I mean, when women are the backstop, when they know that children's lives, the lives of the people who are sick or elderly in their families, the lives of people who are destitute in their communities, if they know that they're the last resort and they know that they don't do that work themselves, no one else will, then but there's a guilt factor too. And so it becomes very easy to push women into these kinds of situations when we devalue them, when we push them into this kind of care work situation, and when we trap them without the support that they need. And so I think it's really a function of these broader social systems. And yet, at the same time, we incentivize men to buy into this system by selling them lies, by selling them myths about gender and this idea that men are just, more suited for paid work than women are, and that women's natural place is in the home. And these ideas are sticky in part because men don't want to think of themselves as the bad guys, but it often makes sense logistically for families to have men be the ones who work for pay and women be the ones who focus on caregiving, because of how we have structured our economy, such that the kinds of jobs open to women, and because of things like motherhood wage penalties, women are penalized in the workforce. And so many of the couples that I interviewed for my research, if both parents were working for pay when they had children, if they had full-time childcare, they'd actually be losing money. And because of gender pay gaps, women were the ones whose salaries were lower. And so logistically, within the context of their families, it made more sense for them to drop out of the workforce or to move to a part-time position and to let their husbands be the breadwinner. But the problem with that is that, the men in those families don't want to see themselves as exploiting women. But that makes these kinds of ideologies, this notion that, women are just happier at home. Kids are just better off with their mothers at home. It makes those ideologies appealing because it gives them a way to feel better about the kinds of choices that they've made that have been limited by the structures that we have.
This is really, really fascinating. I had an MBA, but I chose to be a stay-at-home mom for many years, and then later got back into the workforce. And I now look at my Social Security statement, and on the lines of how much you earned, line after line after line is zero. So I'm probably getting a third as much Social Security as if I had then sent my children to daycare and paid that person and got a job and had income on that line. And so to me, it's a reflection to your point that our society really doesn't value the work that women do. So what are some of the other, I've been really intrigued by the notion that these myths evolve to help men feel better about themselves, because this is really an inequitable situation, the way our economic structures are created here in the United States. What are some of the other myths or lies that you have seen that emerge?
People are told that if you just make the right choices, if you just, choose to go to the right, if you just finish high school, if you just go to the right college, if you just choose the right college major, if you just choose the right partner, that you'll avoid precarity and that you'll have all of the opportunities that you need in society. But the reality is that conflates correlation and causation. And oftentimes it's privilege that allows people to make the kinds of choices that facilitate success in our society, at least disproportionately so. Certainly there are some people who beat the odds, but in the vast majority of cases, it's the people who have more privilege who are able to make those kinds of good choices that then make them, that then lead to more success in the end. And so just simply telling people to make good choices, it's a way to give people hope in a deeply, this, like the kind of gendered myths that we talked about before, these meritocratic myths are deeply, and this gets back to Cass's point about sort of Christianity and religions, and particularly evangelical Christianity, conservative Christianity has played a big role in promoting these kinds of meritocratic ideologies, telling people that if they just have faith, if they just work hard, that they will be rewarded either in life or in death. And this is a powerful message for people, because especially in an unequal society like ours it's psychologically reassuring to believe that hard work is enough. And that's what the surveys show. The vast majority of people in the US believe that everyone can be successful if they just want it enough and work hard enough, despite the evidence to the contrary. And yet those beliefs are so sticky because they give us hope in the context of deep inequalities. And also, as I find in my research, because they allow people who don't have access to the support that they need, who are struggling, to at the same time feel psychologically better about themselves by comparing themselves to others further down the ladder who are just a little bit worse off than they are themselves. I talk in the book about a white evangelical Christian mom who I call April, she and her family, she's a stay-at-home mom. They're getting by on $30,000 a year from her husband's job as a pastor. And, they're struggling economically, but at the same time, she rejects the need for universal childcare, for higher minimum wage laws, for universal health care, kind of opposes all of these efforts to expand the social safety net. And she does so by judging other people, by saying, we don't need those things in my family. And if other people need them, they must just be lazy. They must just not be working hard enough. They must be spending money frivolously. And so it's that idea that she's able to cling to these kinds of meritocratic beliefs, this belief that hard work alone is enough and faith alone is enough. And it's sort of psychologically reassuring for her, given the fact that she is sort of in this place precariously where she wants to feel better about herself, given the kinds of challenges that she faces. And so I think that's another example of the kind of myth that is both appealing to people because of the structures that we live in, but also has these pernicious effects of leading people to underinvest in and devalue the need for a social safety net that could actually help us all.
As I am listening to you and continuing to process what I have been processing living in the West for 29 years, what I am also trying to compute is I come from a part of the world where 3 generations live together. Till you're 18, you have to go to school, taxpayer-funded education, and you go from high school into university or high school into trade school, you come out with a profession. You don't work till you're 18. Your duty is to learn and perfect a craft. Then you go out in the world and contribute to that craft. So you have your parents and your grandparents. Right? Parents are working, grandparents are there. So when you come home from school, you're not alone. And that safety net and the structure is there. I also come from a culture where God is a goddess. So we worship a female deity, right? So where girls are taught that you're not a princess, you're a goddess. And it gives a different sense of self. And as the young people start working and the parents retire and the grandparents age, now the retired parents at 55 mandatory retirement, you're still young enough to care for your aging parents, and you're there to raise the grandkids. So there is no child care. There is no elder care. Social structure takes care of it. And in Sri Lanka, when we get married in the Hindu tradition, the boy moves into the girl's house. Husband comes into the wife's house because it's centered around protection and support of the woman because she is the head of the household as the mother of the children. We are seeing that cultures that understand the multi-generational living, US used to be like that, are actually continuing to reproduce and have a vibrant human propagation, whereas the West is seeing a massive decline. Even the universities are getting ready for a cliff where we don't have enough college-age students. So we're going to shut down universities. We are going to look for elder care, bringing people from overseas. We are socially creating a scenario where girls are growing up saying, why would I give up my life to have another man's children and raise them when I can do whatever I want and be happy? And research shows that unmarried women are happier than married women. When we look at all together, this notion of DIY and devaluing women is actually limiting the survival of the human race in these societies. Is there nobody paying attention, or is this planned obsolescence of the West?
I mean, I think this is to some extent in the West, at least it's by design. That this is, I mean, it is designed to serve the kinds of, it's not designed to serve human well-being. It's designed to serve oftentimes corporate profits when it comes to what is going to drive. And so we've underinvested in communities in ways that make multi-generational households, much more difficult, in part by pushing people to live in places where big business centers are. We've underinvested in small communities. We've made it harder to survive in many parts of the U.S. And in those kinds of small communities, many of which I studied in my research, even the grandparents in those communities can't afford to retire at 55, let alone 65 or 75 in some cases, that they simply don't have the resources to be able to be those full-time caregivers for their children or for their grandchildren. And we've also underinvested in healthcare in ways that make people sicker and make it harder for them to care for others because they don't have the support that they need for themselves. And so I think our systematic underinvestment in communities, particularly low-income communities, communities of color in the U.S., has made it tremendously difficult to sustain those kinds of, alternative models to a sort of government social safety net that exist elsewhere, and have also sort of forced people to move for opportunities, to leave their homes, to move further and further away from their communities, their support networks, to pursue economic, opportunities in their lives. But that also makes it even more necessary to rely on these kinds of supports, kind of formal support systems, as opposed to the kinds of informal caregiving networks that we might have relied on a generation or two ago, even here in the US. And so I think this is designed to push people to make the choices that are best for them in the context of the economy, rather than in the context of human flourishing or in the context of their social lives.
Every single conversation that we have, we always look at the clock and go, oh my gosh, has 25 minutes flown by? And so before we end, we want to make sure that people know how they can get a hold of you. If you, again, want to say the name of your book, hold it up again and tell us how people can get a hold of you. And then what are one or two ideas in your book for some solutions, and do you have a final golden nugget or two that you want to share with the women who are listening to this or who will listen to this?
So the book is Holding It Together, How Women Became America's Safety Net. You can find me on Twitter or X at Jessica Calarco, or on my website at jessicacalarco.com. In terms of takeaways, I argue here that we actually already know what the solutions are. There are plenty of other countries around the world that have models that we can look to for what our social safety net should look like and could lead to better outcomes, could leave us happier and healthier, living longer, being more productive, having better relationships. The real challenge is figuring out how to reject the kinds of myths that are that are undermining the political will, and also the kinds of structures that are in place that allow people with huge amounts of wealth to leverage that wealth to keep the system that we have in place, even if the majority of people would prefer a stronger system. And I argue in the book that one of the potentially best ways to try to reject those myths and to try to demand that stronger social safety net is by helping us to recognize how care links our fates. That all of us are part of care networks, whether those are stronger networks or weaker networks, whether they are meeting everyone's needs or not, all of us will need and give care at some point in our lives. And if we can focus on that shared identity as caregivers, and also focus on the way that breakdowns in any part of that care network affect not only the people directly affected, but the people further out too. I just got an email from a student this morning who said, one of my colleagues at work had an issue with her family, and so she needs to step out to take care of her family, and so I can't, and so I have to fill in for her, and so I can't meet today as we planned. And there's these sort of ripple effects in terms of the way that care breakdowns affect people across networks. And so if we remember that, if we focus on our shared identities as caregivers, if we focus on the way that care connects all of our fates, then that, I would argue, can help us to think about ourselves as part of a union of care or a community of care that can fight together for the kinds of policies, for the kinds of systems and the kinds of structures that would allow us to hold it together, like actually hold all of this responsibility collectively more effectively and more efficiently, rather than trying to each individually hold it together on our own.
That is very, very insightful, Jessica. And I love we are taking this conversation. It's been indoctrinated into this society. Individualism is everything. And if you're not an individualist, then somehow you're a socialist, and then they tie it to communist. I don't know how all of these disparate comparisons get put together and people completely buy it. And individual economy and political spectrums are completely different things, right? A communist China is a thriving capitalist country, but people don't stop to think. And the more we propagate these myths and the more people buy into that, then Our belief is our destiny, and we've created a system of beliefs that are rooted in false dichotomies that continues to propagate this. I am so glad you have helped get this conversation started, but by no means have we scratched even the full surface. So we would love to have you back to build on this when the time is right, because these are conversations we need to have. And we appreciate you investing the time in engaging in our community, becoming a part of this community of women investing in women. And we appreciate the work you do in school, the research, and having these conversations. And to our audience out there, please take a moment and pause, hit the pause button, and think. Clear your mind and sit down and think. If you're a meditator, if you do yoga, whatever it is you do to get in your personal place of peace, during those moments, think about the human condition and the care the human condition needs. If we want to build a society that actually cares, then we need to start putting an infrastructure in place that enables that caring. Otherwise, we're all too busy chasing dollar after dollar to keep a roof over our head. We don't have the time to stop and care about ourselves, our children, our loved ones, let alone our neighbors. And truly, our ability to lift each other up is right inside our power to pause and stop believing what we have fed and start truly thinking from a deeper place.